Friends, today I'm going to tell you a true life story from Oakland, United States of America. It is the story of a young woman named Emily, a girl whose life was marked by sorrow from her earliest days, yet who carried within her a quiet resilience that she herself did not always recognize. Emily's parents passed away when she was still a child, and the loss shaped her in ways she could not yet understand. She was taken in by her aunt, a woman who saw her not as family but as a burden, a mouth to feed, and a reminder of responsibilities she wished she could cast aside. Emily grew up in that house not with the warmth of love, but with the coldness of indifference, often being treated as an outsider in the very place that was supposed to shelter her. Her childhood was filled with moments that should have been joyful, but were instead marked by neglect. She remembered birthdays that passed unnoticed, holidays where she was given the smallest of scraps, and long nights when she lay awake wondering why love seemed to belong to everyone else but her. Her cousins treated her with cruelty, mocking her clothes, her quiet nature, and her lack of parents to defend her. The house was never a home to her, but Emily clung to a fragile hope that perhaps one day someone would see her for who she was and treat her with the kindness she longed for. As she grew into her teenage years, Emily found solace in small things. She would often walk the streets of Oakland at sunset, gazing at the golden glow that painted the sky, imagining that beyond the horizon lay a place where life would be different, where she could escape the harshness of her daily reality. She dreamed of a love that would lift her out of her loneliness, a partner who would see her heart, who would not care about her orphan status but instead cherish her for her kindness and quiet strength. These dreams were not grand fantasies, but rather the fragile threads that kept her spirit from breaking. By the time she turned 18, Emily was a young woman with soft features and eyes that seemed to carry a depth of unspoken pain. Her aunt wasted no time in making it clear that she was no longer welcome to stay. With little more than a few worn clothes and a handful of coins, Emily stepped out into the world, carrying her vulnerability with her, but also a flicker of determination. She found small work cleaning houses, sometimes helping in diners, earning just enough to eat and keep a roof over her head in a cramped boarding room. Life was not easy, but at least she was free of the constant ridicule that had filled her childhood. It was during these years of struggle that she met Marcus Reynolds. He came into her life like a sudden summer storm, overwhelming her with charm and attention she had never known. Marcus was older, confident, and from a respected family in Oakland. To Emily, who had always been overlooked, his interest felt like a miracle. She could hardly believe that someone like him, polished and admired, would choose to look at her, talk to her, and pursue her. The first time he smiled at her, she felt a warmth that she had been searching for her entire life. Marcus had a way of making her feel seen. He spoke to her as though her thoughts mattered, and he carried himself with the assurance of a man who knew the world belonged to him. Emily was drawn in, not just because of his attention, but because he offered her something she had been starved of all her life: validation. When he began to court her, bringing her small gifts and walking with her through the streets, she felt the bitterness of her childhood fading. For once, she dared to believe that perhaps her life was turning around, that fate had finally smiled on her after years of sorrow. Their relationship progressed quickly, fueled by Marcus's intensity and Emily's desperate longing for love. To outsiders, it looked like a fairy tale: the handsome young man from a reputable family and the quiet orphan girl who had finally found her prince. Emily allowed herself to believe it too, convincing herself that her struggles had led her here for a reason. She imagined a future where the loneliness of her past would be replaced by the joy of building a family of her own. When Marcus proposed, Emily was overwhelmed with emotion. She felt unworthy of such devotion, yet also exhilarated that someone of his stature would want to tie his life to hers. Her heart swelled with hope as she thought of the wedding day, the dress, the vows, and the idea of belonging to someone who would finally call her his own. For a girl who had grown up believing she was unwanted, Marcus's proposal was more than a promise of marriage. It was proof that she was not invisible, that she mattered, and that her life could hold joy after all. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Emily allowed herself to live in a haze of excitement. She ignored the subtle disapproval in Marcus's family's eyes, choosing instead to focus on his words, his gestures, his promises. She told herself that love would conquer all, that even if they did not welcome her at first, her sincerity would eventually win them over. She spent long nights in her small room, stitching together pieces of a simple wedding dress, each thread carrying her dreams of a new beginning. She imagined walking down the aisle, her heart full, her eyes meeting Marcus's, believing that this was the moment her life would finally transform. But beneath her joy lingered an unshakable fear. Sometimes, when she caught Marcus's expression in quiet moments, there was a coldness in his eyes that unsettled her. It was fleeting, quickly masked by his usual charm, but enough to plant seeds of doubt deep in her heart. Emily pushed those feelings aside, telling herself she was imagining things, that her insecurities were playing tricks on her. She could not bear to question the one happiness she had finally found, and so she silenced the small voice that warned her something was not quite right. By the time the wedding day arrived, Emily was filled with a nervous anticipation that consumed her entire being. As she stood in the modest church in Oakland, her hands trembling as she adjusted the veil she had sewn herself, she looked into the mirror and saw a woman who had survived so much, who had carried sorrow, yet still found the strength to believe in love. She whispered to herself that this was her chance, that the pain of her past was behind her, and that the future held nothing but joy. She believed with all her heart that Marcus would be her redemption, her family, her forever. She could not have known then that what awaited her was not the fairy tale she had imagined, but a journey into darkness that would test the very limits of her spirit. The day of the wedding in Oakland felt like a dream to Emily. She walked down the aisle with trembling steps, her veil hiding the tears that streamed silently down her face. To everyone else, those tears looked like joy, but inside, they carried the weight of her entire past, the pain of being abandoned, mistreated, and overlooked. Standing in that little church, she thought her life had finally shifted from sorrow to beauty. Marcus stood tall at the altar, handsome and composed, and when he slipped the ring on her finger, she felt as if her heart could burst from relief. The quiet girl who had once been mocked as unwanted now had a man who promised to love her for life. The vows were spoken, the prayers recited, and as the congregation clapped, Emily felt herself swept into a wave of hope she had never known. She believed she belonged now, not just to a man, but to a family, to a life greater than the one she had endured. She carried this fragile hope with her into the reception, smiling as relatives whispered and stared. She ignored the cold glances from Marcus's mother, telling herself it was only a matter of time before love softened their hearts. For once, she believed the story she had always told herself as a child, that patience and kindness could melt even the harshest rejection. As night fell, Emily entered her new home, nervous and eager. She had imagined this moment countless times, the tender intimacy of finally sharing her heart fully with the man who had chosen her. But what she encountered was not tenderness. Marcus, once so attentive, seemed distant, detached, almost irritated by her presence. She tried to reach for him, but he turned away. Her joy wilted into confusion as he made it clear that he did not see her as a partner, but as a possession, something acquired rather than cherished. That first night, instead of warmth, she felt the sharp sting of rejection. Marcus spoke little, his eyes filled with an indifference that chilled her to the core. She lay awake beside him, the weight of reality pressing against her chest, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. But still, she clung to the belief that maybe he was simply tired, maybe the day had been overwhelming. She whispered to herself that tomorrow would be better, that she just had to give it time. Tomorrow came, and then the next. But the warmth she hoped for never arrived. Marcus became colder with each passing day. He avoided her gaze, left her alone in silence, and when he did speak, his words cut her spirit. Emily tried to win his affection through small gestures, cooking meals, cleaning, speaking gently, but nothing softened him. The house was filled with his family's eyes, eyes that never missed a chance to remind her she was not truly one of them. His mother would watch her with thinly veiled disdain, whispering to neighbors about the orphan girl who had trapped her son. His siblings mocked her clumsiness, her simple clothes, her lack of refinement. Emily found herself shrinking, hiding pieces of her personality, desperate not to give them another reason to despise her. Yet no matter how hard she tried, she remained the outsider. Meals were eaten in silence, laughter never reached her ears, and nights were spent alone, staring at the ceiling, wondering how her fairy tale had turned so dark so quickly. The church wedding had promised love, but the home she entered felt like a cage, each day tightening around her until she could hardly breathe. There were moments when Marcus's cruelty became unbearable. Sometimes he would ignore her for days as though she were invisible. Other times he would lash out with cold words, reminding her that she had nothing, that he had saved her from the gutter, and that she should be grateful. Emily would retreat into herself, swallowing her tears, afraid to anger him further, afraid that the fragile stability she clung to might vanish entirely. And yet, despite the torment, she still held on to a small ember of hope. She told herself that marriages took time, that love grew slowly, that perhaps if she endured with patience, he would eventually see her heart and come to love her. She had endured cruelty before, she reasoned, and had survived. Perhaps this too was simply another storm to weather before the sun returned. But that sun never rose. Instead, Emily's life descended further into shadows. Marcus's family treated her like a servant, demanding chores, criticizing her every effort, and laughing at her behind her back. Emily's heart grew heavier with each passing day, yet she still prayed for change. She clung to her faith, whispering prayers at night that God would soften their hearts, that He would give her strength to endure. Her tears soaked her pillow, unseen by anyone but heaven. And then came the moment that shattered what little remained of her fragile hope. Marcus left one evening, claiming he was traveling for business. Days later, news arrived that there had been an accident. His car had been found crushed, his body burned beyond recognition. The family mourned with a display of grief that Emily could hardly process. She stood at the funeral, numb, her hands trembling as she clutched the black dress she wore. She could not believe the man she had married was gone so suddenly. But even in death, the cruelty did not end. As the final prayers were said, Marcus's mother turned to her with eyes sharp as blades. With venom in her voice, she told Emily she was no longer welcome in their home. The word struck like a physical blow. In the same breath that Emily was made a widow at 19, she was also stripped of shelter, of belonging, of even the fragile stability she had endured. She was handed her small bag and cast out into the streets as though she were nothing more than a burden to discard. Emily walked away from the Reynolds house with tears streaming down her face, her heart broken beyond repair. She had lost everything in a matter of days, her husband, her home, her dignity. She wandered the streets of Oakland with no destination, clutching her bag like it contained her very soul, wondering if her life had been cursed from the start. The fairy tale she had believed in was nothing more than a cruel illusion, leaving her with nothing but sorrow and despair. Emily wandered the streets of Oakland after being thrown out of the Reynolds home, her mind blank with grief, her steps unsteady as though the ground itself no longer welcomed her. The city that once held a faint promise now looked cold and merciless, its buildings towering over her like silent judges. She had nowhere to go, no family to run to, no one to call for comfort. The only home she had known since her marriage had rejected her without hesitation, and now, with Marcus gone, she was nothing more than a shadow drifting between strangers. Her mind replayed the wedding day again and again, each memory stabbing deeper into her heart. How foolish she had been to believe that vows meant safety, that love could grow in a house where only hatred was sown. She remembered the way Marcus looked at her with indifference, the sharp remarks that cut her spirit, the coldness that made her feel less than human. She remembered how his family's whispers turned into laughter, how she became the object of their mockery, the unwanted bride they tolerated only for appearance's sake. And now she was not even that. She was no one. She was nothing. 19 years old, standing at the edge of a world that had never wanted her, Emily felt the crushing weight of despair settle on her shoulders. She walked until her legs gave way, finally collapsing on a park bench beneath an old oak tree. The night air was heavy, the stars blurred by her tears. She clutched her small bag to her chest as though it contained her very life, though inside were only a few clothes and the remnants of her dignity. She whispered into the darkness, asking why her life had been filled with pain, why every attempt at love ended in rejection, why God had remained silent through all her prayers. Her stomach growled with hunger, for she had eaten little since the day of the funeral. The last coins in her bag would not buy much, and she knew that soon she would be left with nothing. She thought of her aunt's house, the cold cruelty she had fled, and realized there was no place to return to, no door that would open for her. She was utterly alone, adrift in a city that did not care whether she lived or died. The thought crept into her mind that perhaps it would be easier if she simply ceased to exist. Perhaps death would be kinder than this relentless cycle of rejection. Her tears fell harder at the thought, but she was too weak to fight it. The world had broken her down to nothing but fragments, and she no longer knew how to piece herself together. As she sat trembling on that bench, her heart heavy with despair, she noticed a figure approaching. It was a woman, carrying a small child in her arms. The woman looked tired, her clothes worn, her steps slow from exhaustion. She stopped near Emily, sitting on the opposite end of the bench, rocking her baby gently as the child fussed and cried. Emily turned her head slightly, her eyes drawn to the infant's small face, red from hunger and fatigue. The woman looked as though she carried her own burdens, perhaps heavier than Emily's. Her eyes were filled with sorrow, her movements strained, and as she shifted, Emily noticed the way she glanced at her child's face with helplessness. The baby's cries grew louder, piercing the night air, and the woman's shoulders shook as though she was silently sobbing. Emily's heart ached at the sight. Despite her own suffering, despite her own emptiness, something stirred within her, a reminder of the compassion she had always carried, even when no one showed it to her. She reached into her bag and pulled out the last of her money, a few crumpled bills she had been saving for food. Her hand trembled as she held them, knowing that once they were gone, she would have nothing. But as she looked at the baby's desperate face, she could not hold on to them. She extended her hand toward the woman, offering the bills with a weak smile. The woman hesitated, her eyes widening with surprise. She tried to shake her head, but Emily pressed the money into her hand gently, whispering that the child needed it more than she did. For a moment, silence filled the air between them, broken only by the baby's cries. Then the woman's eyes filled with tears, and she whispered a blessing over Emily, her voice soft but powerful, as though it carried more than just gratitude. She told Emily that though her life was filled with sorrow now, brighter days were coming. She spoke of a future where Emily would not be broken, where she would rise again, where her pain would give way to joy. Her words were unlike anything Emily had ever heard, not just because of their content, but because of the conviction in her tone. It was as though she saw something in Emily that Emily herself could not see, as though she were speaking a prophecy rather than a simple kindness. Emily felt the woman's words sink into her weary soul like a drop of water on parched ground. She wanted desperately to believe them, but she had been disappointed too many times to trust and hope again. Still, the blessing lingered in her heart as the woman rose, cradling her baby, and walked away into the night. Emily watched them go, her own tears falling freely, and for the first time in days, she felt something stir within her besides despair. She whispered into the night, asking if perhaps God had not abandoned her after all. Perhaps this encounter was a sign, a flicker of light in the darkness that had consumed her. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time since Marcus's death, she felt a faint spark of strength. She closed her eyes on that park bench, holding on to the woman's words as though they were the only thing keeping her alive. Little did Emily know, the prophecy spoken by that stranger would prove true in ways she could never imagine. For her story was far from over. Her suffering had reached its deepest point, but soon, hidden truths would come to light that would change everything she thought she knew about Marcus, about his family, and about her own future. The night Emily met the woman in the park, she slept on the bench with the blessing still echoing in her mind. The hard wood beneath her back and the cold air wrapping around her body could not completely erase the strange warmth that lingered in her heart from the stranger's words. When she awoke in the morning, her stomach empty and her body aching, she felt weaker than ever, yet something inside her whispered that she was not finished. She had given away the last of her money, and though she had nothing left, she found herself repeating the woman's promise that brighter days were coming. Emily wandered the streets of Oakland in the days that followed, searching for small work wherever she could find it. Sometimes she cleaned dishes in a diner for a few hours. Sometimes she swept floors. Sometimes she begged quietly for help from people passing by. Life did not suddenly become easier, but she carried herself differently, no longer resigned to despair, but clinging to the hope that somehow she would survive. She told herself that she had already endured the worst, that there was nothing left to fear. But then, one afternoon, as she walked past a corner store, she heard whispers that froze her blood. Two men were speaking in low voices about Marcus Reynolds. At first, she thought she must have misheard, for Marcus was gone, buried, mourned. Yet the men spoke of him as though he were alive, as though he had been seen in another town, living under a different name. Emily's heart raced. She stopped in her tracks, her ears straining to catch every word. The men mentioned fraud, insurance claims, deception. They laughed bitterly about how a man had faked his own death to claim money, leaving his family and wife behind. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The world around her blurred as the realization struck her like a bolt of lightning. Marcus was not dead. The accident, the funeral, the tears, all of it had been a lie. She remembered the coffin lowered into the ground, the mother-in-law's crocodile tears, the way she had been discarded as though she were trash. All of it was staged to rid themselves of her and to profit from her grief. Her knees buckled and she leaned against the store wall, fighting the urge to collapse. Rage and heartbreak surged through her veins like fire. She had mourned a man who was alive, cried tears for someone who had deceived her, and been thrown out into the streets as a widow when she was nothing more than a victim of his schemes. She felt humiliated, used, betrayed in the deepest way possible. The man she had believed to be her savior, her prince, her forever, had treated her as nothing more than a pawn in his game. News of Marcus's fraud spread quickly across Oakland. The Reynolds family, once respected, became the subject of scandal and shame. Neighbors whispered, friends turned away, and soon authorities intervened. Marcus was caught, dragged from his hiding place, and thrown into jail to await trial. Emily watched from the shadows as the family that had mocked and tormented her now hung their heads in disgrace. The very people who had cast her out were now disgraced themselves, and though she did not wish destruction on anyone, she could not deny the strange justice in it all. When she saw Marcus in handcuffs, his once proud head bowed, she felt no satisfaction, only an emptiness that no punishment could fill. She thought of the night she had prayed for his love, the days she had labored to win his heart, and realized how deeply she had been deceived. He had never seen her as a partner, never valued her worth. To him, she had been a convenient disguise, someone to play the part of a wife until he no longer needed her. Yet in that moment of anguish, Emily did something few could understand. She whispered forgiveness. Not because he deserved it, not because the pain had vanished, but because she refused to let hatred poison what little strength she had left. She told herself that Marcus's choices were his own, that his betrayal spoke of his emptiness, not hers. She would not carry his sins on her shoulders any longer. The Reynolds family, broken by scandal, tried in vain to rebuild their reputation. Marcus's mother, once so proud, now walked the streets with her head down. One afternoon, she approached Emily with trembling hands, her eyes filled with a sorrow Emily had never seen before. The woman who had once mocked and despised her now pleaded for understanding, her voice heavy with regret. She admitted that she had been cruel, that she had judged Emily unfairly, and that now she reaped the consequences of her blindness. Emily listened silently, her heart torn between old wounds and the compassion she could never quite silence. She did not forget the night she had been ridiculed, the day she had been thrown into the streets like a beggar. But she also saw the brokenness in the woman's eyes. She offered a nod of acknowledgement, not a full embrace, but not rejection either. She chose mercy, for she had learned that bitterness only deepened pain. Though she did not return to the Reynolds home, Emily began to find her footing again. She sought out small jobs, sometimes working late into the night, her hands blistered and her body weary. Yet there was a strength in her steps that had not been there before. She carried herself like a survivor, not a victim. People who once overlooked her began to notice her quiet resilience, her unwavering kindness even after betrayal. Some offered her work, some offered meals, and slowly a new community began to form around her. Through it all, she never forgot the woman in the park, Angela, whose words had kept her alive on her darkest night. She replayed the blessing again and again in her mind, telling herself that the prophecy must hold meaning, that perhaps her story was not over yet. Every time she felt like giving up, she remembered Angela's voice saying that brighter days were coming, and she forced herself to keep moving. And slowly, those brighter days began to take shape. A family named the Millers, who had heard of her struggles, offered her a place to stay in exchange for helping care for their elderly mother. They treated her with kindness she had never known, inviting her to sit at their table, sharing meals, asking about her day. For the first time, Emily felt what it was like to be welcomed, not as a burden, but as family. She worked hard in their home, tending to the old woman with tenderness, and in return, they gave her safety and stability. Each night, as she lay on her small bed in the Miller house, Emily whispered prayers of gratitude. Her life was far from perfect, but she had survived the storm and found a harbor of peace. She began to rebuild herself piece by piece, allowing hope to grow where despair once lived. She realized that Marcus's betrayal, as devastating as it had not destroyed her. Instead, it had stripped away illusions and forced her to discover the strength she had carried all along. And though she did not know it yet, her journey was far from complete. The prophecy spoken on that park bench was still unfolding, and the brightest part of her story was still waiting to be revealed. By the time Marcus's supposed death and the fraudulent scheme were revealed, I had already been stripped down to nothing, left to wander between despair and faint sparks of faith. But the truth, when it finally surfaced, was not the sweet relief I expected. It came like a tidal wave, pulling me into emotions I never thought I would feel for the man who had betrayed me so profoundly. When the community discovered that Marcus had faked his own death for insurance fraud, shock spread like wildfire. The Reynolds family, who had once held their heads high in the neighborhood, suddenly found themselves at the center of scandal and shame. People whispered in grocery stores, neighbors gathered in hushed circles on sidewalks, and every time I stepped outside, I felt the eyes of pity, judgment, and curiosity fixed on me. For them, it was a story to gossip about, a twist so outrageous that it gave them something to talk about at dinner tables. But for me, it was my life, a wound torn open once again, and one I had to live through every single moment. The police arrested Marcus, and I remember the day I was called to the station to give a statement. Sitting there with cold metal chairs beneath me and the sharp scent of paper and ink in the air, I felt as if my body were floating outside of itself. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, to unleash every ounce of rage that had been building inside me since the night he told me he could never love me. Another part of me wanted to crumple into nothingness, to let the exhaustion take me under, because carrying so much pain had already hollowed me out. But when I finally saw him in that small interrogation room, his hands cuffed, his face stripped of the arrogance he once carried, what shocked me most was not the sight of him. It was the emotion rising within me. I expected hatred. I expected venom to pour out of my mouth, for my hands to shake with fury. Instead, what I felt was a strange, aching sorrow. He looked smaller than I remembered, as if his lies and schemes had eaten away at the very man he used to be. His eyes, no longer sharp and cruel, were sunken, heavy with the weight of being exposed. For the first time, I saw Marcus not as the tyrant who had tormented me, but as a broken man who had destroyed himself with his own greed and deception. And in that moment, as much as my mind screamed that he didn't deserve it, my heart whispered something else. I forgave him. Forgiveness did not mean I excused what he had done, nor did it erase the years of torment. But standing there, looking at him in chains, I realized that holding on to hatred would only chain me as well. I had already been imprisoned by sorrow, by betrayal, by abandonment. I did not want to be imprisoned by bitterness too. So I released it, not for his sake, but for mine. My voice trembled as I told him that I forgave him, that I would not carry his sins as an anchor tied around my spirit. He lowered his head then, unable to meet my eyes, and in that silence, I knew the words had pierced him more deeply than anger ever could. The fallout from the scandal was brutal. The Reynolds family lost their standing in the community. Their once proud home became a place people pointed at in disgrace. And his mother, who had treated me with such cruelty, finally began to show cracks in her armor. One evening she came to me, her face pale, her eyes swollen from crying. For the first time since I had known her, there was no superiority in her voice, no sharpness in her tone. She whispered that she was sorry, that she never should have treated me the way she did, that she had been blind to the way her own son was living a lie. She asked if there was any way I could forgive her. Her apology did not erase the year she had made me feel like less than nothing, but I saw in her eyes the same brokenness I had seen in Marcus. And in that moment, I realized something profound, that pain has a way of humbling even the proudest hearts. I told her that forgiveness was not a gift she had to earn from me, but something I gave freely because I refused to let hatred define her life. Her tears spilled over then, and she clutched my hands with a desperation that startled me. For the first time, I felt the weight of her humanity pressing against mine. The community, too, began to treat me differently. Where once they had only looked at me with pity, now they regarded me with a kind of respect. They saw that I had endured cruelty, deception, and humiliation, yet I had not been broken by it. They saw that instead of lashing out in vengeance, I had chosen a path of resilience and forgiveness. People would stop me on the street, telling me that my strength inspired them, that my story gave them courage in their own struggles. At first, it felt strange, almost uncomfortable, to be seen as a figure of hope. But slowly, I began to accept that perhaps my pain had a purpose larger than myself. Through this storm, I found myself drawn into the arms of a family who treated me with the love I had craved all my life, the Miller family. They were neighbors who had always watched from afar, kind souls who had never once joined in the whispers or the mockery. When my life collapsed, they opened their door to me without hesitation. They did not see me as a widow marked by scandal or a victim weighed down by sorrow. They saw me as Emily, a young woman who had been hurt but who still had value, still had dignity, still had a future. In their home, I tasted for the first time what it felt like to belong, to be embraced not for what I could give, but for who I was. Their kindness became a salve to my wounds. They gave me not only shelter but encouragement, reminding me that I had the power to rebuild my life. With their support, I began to dream again, timidly at first, like a child learning to walk, but then more boldly as I realized that my worth had never been tied to Marcus, to his family, or even to the tragedies of my past. My worth was mine, given by God, unshakable by the storms I had endured. And though I was healing, I never forgot the stranger in the park, Angela, the woman whose words had carried me through my darkest night. I clung to her prophecy, that one day I would laugh again, that one day my tears would turn to joy. I began to see her words as more than comfort. They were a promise, a thread of destiny weaving through my brokenness, pulling me toward a brighter tomorrow I could not yet see. For years, I had walked through shadows, losing my parents, enduring the cruelty of an aunt who never wanted me, being swept into a marriage that looked like salvation but was nothing more than a gilded prison. I had known betrayal, humiliation, and abandonment. I had been stripped down to nothing, left with no family, no husband, no home, and no place to belong. And yet, in the wreckage, the pieces of my true destiny were quietly gathering, waiting for the moment when my broken heart would finally be strong enough to embrace them. The Miller family was the first sign of that destiny. They welcomed me without condition, without judgment, without hesitation. Their home was simple, filled not with grandeur, but with warmth, laughter, and the kind of love that is not performed for the world, but lived in every small gesture. Mrs. Miller would set an extra plate at the table without asking if I was staying, because to her, it was never a question whether I belonged. Mr. Miller would ask about my day not out of politeness, but genuine care, listening with the patience of someone who understands how healing it is to be heard. Their children treated me not as a stranger, not as someone tainted by scandal, but as though I had always been part of their family. For the first time, I tasted the sweetness of being cherished simply for existing. It was in their home that I began to laugh again. At first, it startled me because laughter had become such a foreign sound in my own mouth. The first time I laughed, it was over something small. One of the Miller children had told a silly joke at the table, and I felt tears sting my eyes even as the sound escaped me. That was when I realized Angela's words were unfolding, step by step, just as she had promised in the park when I thought my life was over. "One day you will laugh again," she had said, and now I was living the truth of it. Slowly, I began to rebuild. I took small jobs, learned new skills, and started saving money. Not because I was desperate to escape, but because I wanted to stand on my own feet again. Each day felt like a quiet victory, proof that I was no longer defined by the girl who had been tossed out of her husband's home or left to starve in the streets. I was becoming a woman who had walked through fire and emerged with strength forged from suffering. But even as I built this new life, I carried within me a longing to see Angela again. She had been the stranger who gave me hope when I had nothing left, the voice that reminded me that God had not abandoned me. I did not know where she lived or how to find her, but I prayed that one day our paths would cross again, that I could look into her eyes and tell her that her prophecy had come true. And then, as if destiny itself had been listening, that day came. It happened at the local market, years after the scandal with Marcus had faded from the community's gossip. I was buying groceries when I heard a familiar voice behind me, soft but steady. I turned, and there she was, Angela, older than I remembered but unmistakable, with the same kind eyes that had looked at me with compassion on that desperate night in the park. Beside her stood a young man, tall and strong, carrying a basket for her. She introduced him as her son, the very child I had once given my last money to help, the infant she had carried in her arms when our lives had intersected in the most unlikely of ways. When she realized who I was, her face lit up with tears and joy. She clasped my hands in hers and told me that she had never forgotten me, that she had prayed for me every day since that night, believing that God would fulfill the promise she had spoken. I looked at her son, now grown, healthy, and full of life, and my heart swelled with gratitude that my small act of kindness, born out of despair, had blossomed into something so beautiful. And in that moment, I understood the mystery of destiny, that even the smallest seeds we plant in the darkness can grow into miracles we could never have imagined. Angela embraced me, her tears falling onto my shoulder, and she whispered that she always knew I would find joy again. Standing there in the market, surrounded by the noise of shoppers and the scent of fresh fruit and bread, I felt as though heaven itself had opened for just a moment, allowing me to see the full circle of my journey. From orphan to outcast, from abandoned bride to widow shamed by lies, from broken soul to woman restored. I had lived through it all, and here was the living proof that none of it had been in vain. Life did not suddenly become perfect after that reunion. There were still struggles, still days of doubt, still moments when the weight of memory pressed heavily on my chest. But those struggles no longer defined me. What defined me now was resilience, forgiveness, and the unshakable knowledge that I was never truly abandoned, even when I felt most alone. The laughter I shared in the Miller household, the tears I shed in Angela's arms, the forgiveness I gave to Marcus and his mother, all of it became threads woven together into a tapestry of survival and grace. And so, as I look back on my story, I no longer see only pain. I see the hand of God guiding me through storms, the kindness of strangers becoming lifelines, and the strength within myself that I never knew existed until it was tested. I see that sometimes the very things meant to destroy us become the soil in which our greatest purpose grows. I see that forgiveness, though difficult, can set us free in ways vengeance never could. I see that laughter can return even to the mouth that has only known sobbing.
Friends, if there is anything I want you to carry from my story, it is this. No matter how dark your night, no matter how deep your betrayal, no matter how abandoned you may feel, there is always a new dawn waiting. The storm does not last forever, and even in the most shattered moments, seeds of hope are being planted. I was the orphan no one wanted, the bride no one loved, the widow left with nothing. And yet today, I am the woman who found family, forgiveness, and laughter again. Angela was right. One day I did laugh again. And if I could, so can you.